Chapter 1. Homecoming. The Georgia heat hit like a wall when Blake Barnes stepped out of his air-conditioned truck. 42 years old, with the kind of lean muscle that came from construction work rather than gyms, Blake wiped the sweat from his brow and surveyed his property. The two-story farmhouse had belonged to his parents, and he'd spent the last 5 years fixing it up after his discharge from the Marines. It wasn't much, but it was his, a refuge after 12 years of deployments and the kind of memories that still woke him at 3 a.m. His phone buzzed. His sister's number. Blake, thank God. Patty Rubio's voice cracked with exhaustion. Did you get my messages? Just got back from the Hendricks job. What's wrong? It's Carlos. I need you to take him for the summer. Patty had remarried 3 years ago to Ramiro Rubio, a regional manager for a pharmaceutical company. Blake had never warmed to the man. Something about his too-white smile and the way he dominated every conversation. What happened to your trip to Europe? Ramiro's work. It's complicated. Please, Blake. Carlos needs time away from here. Things have been tense. Blake heard something in his sister's voice, a tremor she was trying to hide. Patty, what's going on? Just, please. 2 months. I'll explain everything when we get back. Blake looked at the empty house, then at the workshop behind it where he'd been restoring a 1967 Mustang. He'd been looking forward to a quiet summer. But Carlos was 13, and Blake remembered being that age, the year his own father died, the year everything changed. When are you bringing him? Tomorrow morning. Thank you, Blake. You have no idea what this means. The line went dead before he could ask more questions. Carlos Rubio arrived the next morning in Ramiro's black Mercedes, looking small in the passenger seat. The boy had his mother's dark eyes, but kept them fixed on his phone, thumbs flying across the screen. What struck Blake immediately were the black leather gloves on his hands, incongruous in the June heat. Hey, kiddo, Blake said, pulling open the car door. Carlos mumbled something that might have been a greeting, still not looking up. Ramiro didn't get out of the car. We appreciate this, Blake. Carlos has been going through a phase. Rebellious stuff. We thought some time away from the city might straighten him out. Blake studied his brother-in-law through the open window. Ramiro's cologne was expensive, his suit pristine despite the heat. But there were dark circles under his eyes, and his fingers drummed an anxious rhythm on the steering wheel. A phase, Blake repeated flatly. You know how kids are these days. Too much internet, bad influences. Ramiro's smile didn't reach his eyes. Keep him busy. Physical work, discipline, that's what he needs. Your military background should help. Something about the way Ramiro said it made Blake's jaw tighten. I'm not running a boot camp. Of course not. Ramiro's tone suggested he thought exactly that. Carlos, get your things. The boy moved like he was walking to an execution, hauling a duffel bag from the back seat. Blake noticed he struggled with the weight, and when he reached to help, Carlos flinched. I got it, the boy muttered, still wearing those gloves. Ramiro drove away without another word, leaving a cloud of dust in the driveway. Blake carried a box of Carlos's belongings, mostly books and a laptop, while the boy trudged up the porch steps. You allergic to something? Blake asked, nodding at the gloves. No. Then why? My hands are sensitive, okay? Carlos's voice cracked with adolescent defensiveness. The sun hurts them. Blake had seen enough in Fallujah and Kandahar to recognize a lie, but he also knew when to wait. All right, let me show you your room. The first week established a routine. Blake woke at dawn, made breakfast, usually eggs and toast, sometimes pancakes, and found Carlos already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with his gloved hands wrapped around a mug of orange juice, staring at nothing. The boy never took the gloves off. Not during meals, not while doing chores, not even in the 95-degree heat when they worked in the garden Blake had started. When Blake suggested he might be more comfortable without them, Carlos's response was always the same. My hands are sensitive. Blake didn't push. Instead, he watched. Carlos was quiet, but not stupid. When Blake taught him how to use the table saw in the workshop, the boy listened intently, asked good questions. When they worked on the Mustang's engine, Carlos proved to have a natural understanding of mechanics. But there was a sadness in him, a weight no 13-year-old should carry. At night, Blake heard him crying through the bedroom wall. On the 8th day, Blake tried calling Patty. The call went to voicemail. He tried Ramiro's number, same result. He texted, everything okay? Carlos seems troubled. No response. Blake stood on his porch that evening, watching Carlos throw a tennis ball against the barn wall with mechanical precision, still wearing those damn gloves. The boy's form was off, favoring his left hand in a way that suggested pain. Something was wrong. Blake had learned in the Marines to trust his gut, and his gut was screaming that his nephew was in trouble. Chapter 2. The Bathroom Incident. Blake had always been an early riser, a habit from the military that never left him. At 5:47 a.m. on a Thursday, 2 weeks into Carlos's stay, he padded quietly down the hallway toward the bathroom, planning to shower before starting breakfast. The bathroom door was cracked open, lights spilling into the dim hallway. Blake heard water running. He almost called out, almost announced himself. Later, he'd wonder what made him stay silent. Instinct, perhaps, or the kind of situational awareness that had kept him alive in combat zones. Instead, he moved quietly, placing each foot carefully on the old floorboards that he knew wouldn't creak. Through the gap in the door, he saw Carlos at the sink, his back to the door. The boy's gloves lay on the counter, and he was washing his hands with the concentrated focus of someone performing surgery. Blake's breath caught. Carlos's palms were a landscape of horror. Chemical burns, fresh and healing, created a patchwork of raw red flesh and white scar tissue. Some burns were circular, precise, like someone had pressed hot metal against the skin. Others were irregular, suggesting splashes or spills. The pattern continued up his wrists, disappearing under his sleeves. But it was the newer burns that made Blake's hands clench into fists. Dark, angry wounds that couldn't have been more than a few days old. Carlos reached for a tube of medical ointment, the expensive kind you needed a prescription for, and began applying it with practiced efficiency. His face, reflected in the mirror, was blank. Not pained, not scared, just empty, like he'd disconnected from his body to survive what had been done to it. Blake felt his Marine training kick in, assess, plan, act. But this wasn't a combat situation with clear enemies and rules of engagement. This was his nephew, damaged in ways Blake was only beginning to understand. He stepped back silently, moving to the kitchen where his phone sat charging. His hands shook as he pulled up his sister's number again. Straight to voicemail. Ramiro's too. Blake's mind raced through possibilities. Abuse, obviously. But the pattern of burns was specific, methodical. Not rage, but something else. Something worse. He heard the bathroom door open, footsteps in the hallway. Carlos appeared in the kitchen doorway, gloves back in place, his face carefully neutral. "Morning," the boy said. "Sit down," Blake said, his voice harder than he intended. Carlos froze, something like fear flickering across his face before he shuddered it away. "I didn't do anything." "Sit down." The boy sank into a kitchen chair, and Blake saw him preparing for something. A lecture, punishment, rejection. He'd seen that look before, on the faces of Iraqi children who'd learned that adults were sources of pain. Blake pulled out the chair across from him and sat, forcing himself to breathe, to moderate his tone. "I saw your hands." Carlos's face went white. "I can explain. No lies. Not to me. Not anymore." Blake leaned forward. "Who's hurting you?" "Nobody's." "Carlos." Blake's voice could have cut steel. "I spent 12 years in the Marines. I've seen chemical burns before. Those on your hands? That's not sensitivity. That's not an accident. Someone is doing that to you, and I need to know who." The boy's composure cracked. His breath hitched, and tears welled in his eyes. But he fought them back with the desperation of someone who'd learned that crying only made things worse. "I can't," Carlos whispered. "You don't understand. If you tell, I will handle it." Blake's voice was iron. "But I can't protect you if I don't know what we're facing." "You can't protect me." Carlos's voice broke into a sob. "Nobody can. He said if I told anyone, he'd hurt Mom. He'd hurt you. He said he has people everywhere. And who? Who said that?" Carlos's whole body shook. Please don't make me. Just send me back. I'll be more careful. I won't mess up again." Blake moved around the table, crouching beside his nephew's chair. Every instinct screamed at him to demand answers, to push, but he forced himself to stillness. "Carlos, look at me." The boy raised his eyes, Patty's eyes, terrified and desperate. "I am going to protect you," Blake said. "And your mother. But I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Silence stretched between them, broken only by the ticking of the kitchen clock and Carlos's ragged breathing. Finally, the boy nodded. "Okay," Blake said. "Start from the beginning. Tell me everything." Chapter 3. The Truth Emerges. Carlos's story came out in fragments, disjointed and painful. Blake made coffee and sat across from his nephew, listening without interruption as the pieces fell into place. It had started 6 months ago. Ramiro had come home with a business proposition for Carlos, a way for the boy to earn his keep and learn responsibility. At first, it seemed innocent. Organizing Ramiro's home office, filing documents, basic administrative work. Then Ramiro introduced Carlos to his business associates. Blake's blood ran cold as Carlos described them. Terrence Reyes, a chemist who'd lost his license after a malpractamine scandal. Perry Jefferson, who handled distribution, and Mel LeBlanc, who Carlos described as the scary one who didn't talk much, but was always there. They were making drugs? Blake interrupted. Not drugs. I mean, yes, technically, but Carlos struggled to explain. Ramiro called it pharmaceutical arbitrage. He'd get chemicals from his company, and Terrence would synthesize prescription medications. The kind people need but can't afford. Blake understood immediately. He was running a black market pharmacy. He said it was helping people, that the pharmaceutical companies were the real criminals, charging thousands for medications that cost dollars to make. Carlos's voice was small. He showed me news stories about people dying because they couldn't afford insulin, heart medication. He made it sound like we were heroes. And the burns. Carlos's hands tightened on his coffee mug, leather gloves creaking. Terrence needed help in the lab. Ramiro said I had to learn the business. But some of the chemicals, if you spill them or mix them wrong. He trailed off. He was using you as child labor in an illegal drug lab, Blake stated flatly. And when you got hurt, he what? Threatened you. The first time, he seemed worried. Took me to a private doctor he knew, made me promise not to tell Mom. Said it was an accident, that it wouldn't happen again. Carlos's voice grew hollow. But it did. And the second time, Mel was there. He explained that if anyone found out, police, Mom, anyone, they'd all go to jail. Including Mom, because she lived in the house where the operation was run. Blake forced himself to stay calm. Your mother doesn't know. No. Ramiro keeps his lab in a storage facility across town. Mom thinks he's working late. Carlos met Blake's eyes. He said if I told her, she'd try to stop him. And then his business partners would make sure she disappeared. He showed me. The boy's voice cracked. He showed me pictures of other people who'd tried to cause problems. What happened to them? Jesus Christ, Blake muttered. He stood, pacing the kitchen, his mind cataloging information the way he'd been trained. Ramiro Rubio wasn't just running a criminal enterprise. He was manipulating and threatening a child, using Blake's sister as leverage. That's why I'm here, isn't it? Blake said. Ramiro sent you away. Carlos nodded. The last batch went wrong. I spilled a whole beaker of precursor chemical. It ate through my gloves, burned my hands bad. I couldn't work for a while, and they were behind on production. Ramiro was furious. He said I was useless, a liability. He decided to send me away for the summer to think about my responsibilities and decide if I wanted to be part of the family. The implied threat was clear: cooperate or be cut off. In Ramiro's world, being cut off probably meant something more permanent than just losing financial support. Blake pulled out his phone. I'm calling the police. No. Carlos lunged forward, panic in his eyes. You can't. They have contacts in the department. Ramiro told me. He has cops on his payroll. If you call the wrong people, they'll warn him. And then what? Then Mom dies. And maybe us too. Carlos was crying now, the teenager veneer completely stripped away, revealing the terrified child underneath. Please, Uncle Blake. I shouldn't have told you. Just forget it. I'll go back at the end of summer. I'll be more careful. Absolutely not. Blake's voice cut through the boy's spiral. You're not going back to that. Ever. But Mom, I will handle Ramiro. And his partners. And anyone else involved. Blake crouched in front of Carlos again. But I need to do this right. Smart. Can you tell me everything you know? Locations, schedules, names, how the operation works. Carlos wiped his eyes with his gloved hands. Why? Because I'm not calling the local cops who might be dirty. I'm calling people I trust, people from my unit who know how to handle situations like this. Blake's jaw set in a hard line. And because Ramiro made a serious mistake. What mistake? He threatened my family. Blake's eyes were cold. And he clearly didn't do his homework on who your uncle really was before he decided to do that. They spent the next 3 hours at the kitchen table. Carlos drew maps, wrote down names, detailed every location and person he could remember from his 6 months of forced involvement. Blake took notes on his laptop, organizing information into tactical briefings he'd used 100 times in the Marines. Ramiro's operation was more sophisticated than Blake had initially thought. The main synthesis lab was in a commercial storage facility, Unit 247, rented under a shell company. Perry Jefferson ran a distribution network through 3 seemingly legitimate clinics that served low-income patients. The medications were real, the pricing compassionate, but the source was illegal and the quality control questionable. Terrence Reyes operated the lab on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday nights, from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. when the storage facility was least active. Mel LeBlanc provided security and handled problems, a euphemism Carlos didn't fully understand but feared deeply. Ramiro coordinated everything, using his position at Liberty Med Pharmaceuticals to divert chemicals and create false inventory reports. He'd been running the operation for 3 years, growing more ambitious and reckless. "How much money are we talking about?" Blake asked. Carlos shrugged. "I heard Perry tell Ramiro they'd cleared $200,000 last month alone. Ramiro's been buying things, expensive things. A new car for Mom, renovations on the house. Mom thinks his company's giving him bonuses." Blake did the math. At that rate, Ramiro was pulling in over $2 million a year, tax-free. That kind of money created desperation. People protected revenue streams like that with violence. His phone rang, a Virginia area code he recognized immediately. Nathan Bender, his former staff sergeant, now working private security in Norfolk. "Bender," Blake answered. "Barnes. Got your text. What's the situation?" "Encrypted line?" "Always. Talk to me." Blake laid out the situation in crisp, military brevity. Bender listened without interruption, another old habit from their unit. "You're sure about the dirty cops?" Bender asked. "Carlos says Ramiro name-dropped a Detective Leonard Clayton and a Sergeant Earl Hardin. I can't verify, but I'm not risking it." "Smart. You need a team?" "Maybe. First, I need intel verification and some legal navigation. Can you tap that FBI contact you mentioned last year?" "Rebecca Ross?" "Yeah, she owes me a favor. Federal task force work on pharmaceutical fraud. This is in her wheelhouse." Bender paused. "Blake, if these guys are as connected as the kid says, I know the risks." "Do you?" "Because this isn't Hellman Province. You can't just neutralize threats and move on." Blake looked at Carlos, who was staring at his gloved hands with that dead expression that made Blake's heart ache. "These people burned a child, Bender. Repeatedly. Threatened to kill my sister. I'm not walking away from this." "Didn't say walk away. Said be smart." Bender's tone softened. "I'll call Ross tonight. Meanwhile, you keep that kid safe and gather every piece of evidence you can. Photos of his hands, written testimony, anything physical he took from the lab. Already on it. And Blake? Watch your 6. Guys running an operation this size don't hesitate to clean up loose ends." The call ended, and Blake found Carlos watching him with something like hope in his eyes. "What happens now?" the boy asked. "Now? We build a case so airtight that Ramiro and his friends spend the next 20 years in federal prison." Blake's smile was cold. "But first, we're going to document everything they did to you. And I need you to be brave a little while longer. Can you do that?" Carlos nodded, then hesitated. "Uncle Blake, what you said about Ramiro making a mistake." "Yeah. What did you mean?" Blake thought about the men in his unit, the operators he'd served with, the skill set he'd developed over 12 years in some of the world's worst combat zones. He thought about the workshop behind the house where he built things, fixed things, and sometimes dismantled them completely. "Your stepfather is used to dealing with scared kids and people desperate for medication," Blake said. "He's not used to dealing with someone who has training in direct action operations, tactical planning, and what the Marines very specifically call close quarters combat." He met his nephew's eyes. He's about to learn the difference. Chapter 4, Building the Case. Rebecca Ross arrived 3 days later, driving a nondescript sedan and wearing jeans and a Georgetown sweatshirt that made her look like a graduate student rather than an FBI special agent. She was in her late 30s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of bringing down complex criminal organizations. Blake met her at a diner 20 miles from his property, with Carlos in tow. The boy had been nervous all morning, convinced that any contact with law enforcement would somehow alert Ramiro. "Your hands," Rebecca said immediately, after the briefest of introductions. Carlos looked at Blake, who nodded. Slowly, the boy removed his gloves. Rebecca's expression didn't change, but Blake saw her pupils dilate, the only sign of her reaction. She pulled out her phone and began taking photographs, methodical and thorough. "How many incidents?" she asked. 15, maybe 20. Carlos's voice was barely above a whisper. "The big ones, anyway. Lots of smaller splashes." "And your stepfather witnessed these injuries?" "He caused some of them. When I was too slow or messed up the measurements." Carlos swallowed hard. Terrence was usually more careful, but Ramiro would push us to work faster. Rebecca took notes, then looked at Blake. "Bender gave me the overview. I need details. Everything. They spent 4 hours in that diner booth." Rebecca recorded Carlos's testimony, cross-referenced the names and locations, and made calls to her contacts. By the time she pushed away her third cup of coffee, her expression was grim. "Your instincts about dirty cops were correct," she told Blake. "Clayton's been on our radar for 2 years, suspected of taking payments from various criminal enterprises. Hardin is his partner. We haven't been able to prove anything, but they've consistently been the officers responding to complaints in the warehouse district where your brother-in-law operates." "Can you move on Ramiro?" Blake asked. "Not yet. Everything we have is testimony from a minor, which defense attorneys will shred, claiming coercion, suggesting the father-son relationship is contentious." Rebecca held up a hand before Blake could protest. "I believe Carlos completely, but belief doesn't equal conviction in federal court. Then what do we need? Physical evidence from the lab, financial records, communications between the conspirators. Basically, I need someone inside the operation." Blake and Rebecca locked eyes across the table. "No," she said. "Absolutely not. You're a civilian. I'm a Marine. Inactive status." Rebecca leaned forward. "Blake, I appreciate what Bender told me about your service record. But this isn't a combat zone. If you go in there and something happens, any evidence you gather gets tossed, and I lose my case. What if I had a legal reason to be there? Such as..." Blake turned to Carlos. "When's the next scheduled production run?" "Saturday. Ramiro texted me yesterday, asking about formulas I'd memorized. I think they're having trouble without me." "Perfect." Blake pulled out his phone, scrolling through the messages he'd ignored from Ramiro over the past week. "He's been trying to check on Carlos, make sure I'm straightening him out. What if I tell him the tough love is working, and Carlos wants to come back early? Wants to show he's committed to being part of the family? You're suggesting we send a 13-year-old back into an illegal drug lab?" Rebecca's voice could have frozen nitrogen. "I'm suggesting I convince Ramiro that I want to see what my nephew has been learning." Concerned uncle checking on his nephew's summer job. Blake's mind was already working through the tactical approach. "Ramiro's arrogant. He thinks I'm just dumb muscle. If I play it right, he might actually show me the operation, especially if he thinks he can recruit me." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. "It's entrapment if we set it up. Only if you're involved. But if a concerned uncle independently decides to visit his brother-in-law's business and happens to see criminal activity and happens to report it to the FBI with photographic evidence." Blake let the implication hang. "You're talking about going undercover without training, without backup, into an operation run by people who've already proven they're willing to hurt a child." Rebecca shook her head. "I can't officially sanction this." "Officially," she sighed. "Unofficially, if a civilian were to provide me with admissible evidence gathered without breaking any laws themselves, I'd be obligated to investigate." She pulled a small device from her pocket, no bigger than a button. "This is a personal item I own. Commercial GPS tracker, completely legal to buy. If someone were to track their own vehicle with it, and that vehicle happened to visit locations of interest, that's not my business." Blake took the device. "And if that someone happened to have a smartphone with a camera? Photographs taken in spaces where illegal activity is openly occurring, like a storage unit your brother-in-law voluntarily shows you, would be admissible, especially if you feared for your safety or your nephew's safety." Rebecca's tone was carefully neutral. "Of course, I'd strongly advise against putting yourself in danger." "Noted." Blake. Rebecca's professional mask dropped for a moment. "These people are dangerous. Mel LeBlanc has suspected ties to organized crime in New Orleans. If he even suspects you're a threat, Then I'll handle it the way I was trained to handle threats. Blake's voice was flat. Ma'am, with all respect, they hurt my nephew. Repeatedly. They threatened my sister. And they're going to keep doing it unless someone stops them. You've got legal concerns. I don't. That's exactly what worries me. Carlos, who'd been silent through most of the exchange, spoke up. Uncle Blake, you don't have to do this. Maybe we could just. I could just disappear. Change my name. Go somewhere. No. Blake and Rebecca said simultaneously. Blake softened his tone. Carlos, running means they win. It means they keep hurting other people. Maybe other kids. He looked at Rebecca. When can you move once I get the evidence? If you can give me photos of the lab, evidence of the chemicals, anything showing Ramiro's involvement, and ideally some financial records, I can have a federal warrant executed within 48 hours. She paused. But Blake, you need to understand. If something goes wrong, if they catch you photographing anything, I can't protect you. Legally, you'd be on your own until we could mobilize. How long would that take? In a best-case scenario, if you triggered an emergency signal, 20 minutes for local police, 40 for my team. Blake did the math. 20 minutes was an eternity in a combat situation. 40 minutes was a lifetime. But he'd operated in worse conditions, with longer response times and higher stakes. I'll need 3 days to prepare, he said. And I'll need Carlos to brief me on the lab layout, the people, every detail he can remember. Rebecca stood, collecting her things. I was never here. We never had this conversation. If anyone asks, we met by coincidence. She handed Blake a business card with a handwritten number on the back. That's my personal cell. If you need immediate extraction, call it. But Blake. Yes, ma'am. Don't need immediate extraction. Just get the evidence and get out. After she left, Carlos stared at his uncle. You're really going to do this? Yeah. Why? I mean, you barely know me. You could just send me back to Mom. Let the FBI handle it eventually. Blake interrupted him. When I was in Kandahar, second deployment, our unit found a compound where Taliban fighters were using kids as human shields. Command said to wait for air support, minimize civilian casualties. My staff sergeant, guy named Bender, you met him on the phone. He said screw that, we're going in. What happened? We got the kids out. Lost a guy doing it. Lance Corporal Martinez, good man, had a daughter back home. Blake's voice was steady, but his eyes were distant. Before he died, Martinez told Bender it was worth it. That's some things you don't compromise on. And this is one of those things. Your family, Carlos. And family protects family. No matter what. The boy's eyes filled with tears, but this time he didn't try to hide them. Thank you. Blake pulled his nephew into a hug, feeling the tension in the boy's thin frame, the weight of months of fear and pain. Thank you for trusting me enough to tell me the truth. Now let's go home and start planning how to take these bastards down. Chapter 5. Infiltration. The text to Ramiro was carefully crafted. Hey, wanted to update you on Carlos. Kid's been working hard here, learning discipline. He's been talking about wanting to prove himself, show he's responsible. Mentioned something about the work you had him doing. I'm curious about this business of yours. Sounds like you're teaching him valuable skills. Any chance I could see what he's been learning? Might help me understand how to mentor him better. Ramiro's response came within an hour. Blake, great to hear he's maturing. The work is a special project. Pharmaceutical consulting, very technical. Not many people understand it. But if you're genuinely interested in Carlos's development, I could show you our operation. Saturday night, 10 p.m.? I'll text you the address. Blake showed the message to Carlos, who'd grown pale. He never invites people to the lab. Never. He thinks he's recruiting me, Blake said. Which means he'll want to impress me, show me how sophisticated his operation is. Or he suspects something and wants to kill you. That's also possible. Blake's tone was matter of fact. Which is why I'm going in prepared. The next 3 days were intensive planning. Blake converted his workshop into a tactical operations center, mapping out the storage facility based on Carlos's descriptions and satellite imagery from Google Maps. The facility was in an industrial area, 12 long buildings, each containing 50 units. Building E, Unit 247. Carlos walked Blake through every detail of the lab, the layout, where Terrence kept the chemicals, where the synthesis equipment was located, the small office where Ramiro kept his records. The boy's memory was photographic, rendered in terrifying detail by months of forced familiarity. Mel usually stands by the door, Carlos said, marking an X on Blake's diagram. He doesn't help with production, just watches. He has a gun. I've seen it. What kind? I don't know guns. Black, not a revolver. Boxy, probably a Glock. Okay. Anyone else armed? Ramiro has one too, but he keeps it in his briefcase, not on him. Blake made notes. 2 confirmed weapons, possibly more. 3 adult men, all physically capable. The storage unit was isolated. The nearest active units were at least 100 feet away. No cameras inside the unit itself, according to Carlos, but the facility had exterior surveillance. He called Bender. I need a favor. Name it. You still have that Kevlar vest you borrowed from the Norfolk Armory? Might have forgotten to return it. What? I'm going in Saturday night. Silence on the line. Then, Blake, this is insane. Probably. But I need that vest. And maybe your thoughts on entry tactics for a confined space with multiple hostiles. Bender sighed. I'm texting you an address in Atlanta. Be there Friday afternoon. We're going to spend 12 hours running scenarios until you don't get yourself killed. Friday afternoon found Blake at a private shooting range outside Atlanta, owned by one of Bender's security company clients. Bender had brought 2 other former Marines from their unit, Damon McKenzie, a communications specialist, and Lawrence Schaefer, who'd done 3 tours as a reconnaissance scout. You're not armed? Lawrence asked, incredulous, after Blake explained the plan. Can't legally carry in that situation. It'd compromise any evidence I gather. So you're going into a drug lab with armed criminals, completely unarmed, to take photos? Basically, Blake, with all due respect, that's the stupidest tactical plan I've ever heard. Noted. Help me make it less stupid. They spent hours running scenarios. Damon fitted Blake with a nearly invisible microphone, commercial equipment, completely legal, that would transmit to a recording device in Blake's truck. Lawrence drilled him on observation techniques, how to photograph without being obvious, where to position himself to maximize tactical advantage despite being unarmed. Bender focused on the psychological aspect. Ramiro's going to test you. See if you're really just a concerned uncle or if you're a threat. You need to be dumb muscle, impressed by his operation, maybe a little concerned about legality, but ultimately persuadable. Can you do that? Blake thought about 12 years of maintaining operational security in active combat zones, of blending with local populations, of making enemies believe he was anything other than what he actually was. Yeah, I can do that. And if it goes sideways? I extract, call Rebecca's emergency line, and get clear of the facility before they can pursue. And if you can't extract? Blake met his former staff sergeant's eyes. Then I handle it the way we were trained to handle overwhelming force. I adapt and overcome. That's what I'm afraid of, Bender muttered. Saturday arrived with oppressive heat and clear skies. Blake spent the morning going through his pre-mission ritual, the same one he'd used before every patrol in Iraq and Afghanistan. Physical exercise to burn nervous energy. Equipment check. Mental rehearsal. A phone call to his sister that went to voicemail, where he didn't mention what he was about to do, but told her he loved her. Carlos was a wreck. The boy paced the house, unable to eat, watching Blake prepare with wide eyes. What if something goes wrong? Carlos asked for the 10th time. Then I'll handle it. But what if? Blake stopped what he was doing and crouched in front of his nephew. Carlos, I need you to listen to me. I've done hundreds of operations more dangerous than this. I've cleared compounds under enemy fire, extracted hostages from hostile territory, conducted reconnaissance deep behind enemy lines. This is just information gathering. Those people know what they're doing is wrong. They're desperate. Desperate people are dangerous. You're right. Which is why I'm not going in cocky or careless. Blake put his hands on the boy's shoulders. But I am going in. Because this ends now. You don't spend another day afraid of them. Understood. Carlos nodded, tears threatening. Good. Now, if I'm not back by 2 a.m., or if you don't hear from me by midnight, you call this number. Blake handed him a card with Rebecca Ross's emergency contact. You tell her exactly what happened, and you do whatever she tells you. Got it. Got it. At 9:45 p.m., Blake climbed into his truck, wearing jeans and a casual button-up shirt that hid the Kevlar vest underneath. The GPS tracker Rebecca had given him was affixed to his truck's undercarriage. His phone, fully charged, camera ready, was in his pocket. The microphone Damon had provided was barely visible as a small mole on his collar. He drove toward the address Ramiro had sent, his mind calm and focused. This was familiar territory, in a way. Different terrain, different stakes, but the fundamentals were the same. Gather intelligence, maintain cover, complete the objective. The storage facility loomed ahead, sodium lights casting orange halos in the darkness. Building E was toward the back, away from the main office. Blake pulled into the visitor parking area and sent a text. Here. Ramiro's response. Building E, Unit 247. Doors open. Blake sat in his truck for 30 seconds, controlling his breathing, centering himself. Then he got out and walked toward the building, toward whatever waited inside, toward the moment when everything would either fall perfectly into place or spectacularly apart. The door to Unit 247 was indeed open, spilling fluorescent light into the darkness. Blake stepped inside and found himself facing a sophisticated laboratory that would have looked at home in any legitimate pharmaceutical facility. And standing in the middle of it, wearing an expensive smile and latex gloves, was Ramiro Rubio. Blake, Ramiro said warmly. Welcome to the future of accessible healthcare. Behind him, Terrence Reyes looked up from a beaker of bubbling liquid. And in the corner, watching with dead eyes and a visible shoulder holster, stood Mel LeBlanc. Blake smiled his best good old boy smile. Impressive setup you've got here, Ramiro. Carlos wasn't kidding. Please, Ramiro gestured expansively. Let me give you the tour. And Blake, recording every word, photographing every surface he could manage discreetly, walked deeper into the lion's den. Chapter 6. The Trap Springs. Ramiro was in full presentation mode, treating Blake to a 45-minute lecture on pharmaceutical synthesis, corporate greed, and his vision for democratizing healthcare. Blake played his role perfectly, asking basic questions, expressing concern about legality, while showing grudging admiration for the operation's sophistication. The beauty, Ramiro explained, gesturing to rows of equipment, is that we're producing medications that are chemically identical to the brand-name versions. Same efficacy, fraction of the cost. We're bypassing the middlemen who inflate prices by 1,000%. But it's still illegal, Blake said, just enough skepticism to seem genuine. Technically, yes. But is it immoral? Ramiro's eyes gleamed. We've helped hundreds of diabetics afford insulin. Heart patients get their medication without choosing between pills and rent. The only victims are pharmaceutical executives who won't be able to afford their third yacht. Blake let his phone's camera, positioned to look like he was just holding it casually, capture the workspace. Bags of precursor chemicals, clearly labeled with pharmaceutical company logos. A laptop, probably containing the financial records Rebecca needed. Carlos's old workstation, still set up, chemical burns visible on the metal surface. Terrence Reyes remained silent through most of the tour, methodically working through his synthesis process. But Blake noticed the chemist watching him, evaluating. This man wasn't stupid, and he definitely wasn't buying Blake's act as thoroughly as Ramiro seemed to be. Mel LeBlanc hadn't moved from his position by the door. The man was 40-ish, built like a linebacker, with the kind of stillness that came from military or law enforcement training. Blake recognized a fellow predator. So what do you think? Ramiro asked. Could you see Carlos coming back to work with us? He was actually quite good once he learned to be careful. There it was, the recruitment pitch Blake had been waiting for. I don't know, Blake said slowly. He's just a kid. And those burns on his hands. Unfortunate accidents, Ramiro said smoothly. Part of the learning process. We've since implemented better safety protocols. Have you? Blake let an edge creep into his voice. Because it looked to me like you were using my nephew as cheap labor in a dangerous environment, then threatening him to keep quiet about it. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Ramiro's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold. Carlos has been telling stories, has he? He told me everything. Blake kept his posture relaxed, but his weight was balanced, ready to move. About the lab, the threats, how you've been using my sister as leverage. I see. Ramiro glanced at Terrence, then at Mel. That's unfortunate. For you, yeah. You're recording this, aren't you? Terrence's voice cut in, sharp and analytical. That shirt's just slightly too bulky in the collar. And you've been positioning your phone very deliberately. Blake didn't bother denying it. Everything. Including the part where you admitted to coercing a minor into illegal drug manufacturing. Ramiro's facade cracked completely. Mel. The big man moved with surprising speed, pulling his weapon and pointing it at Blake's chest. Phone. Now. Blake calculated angles, distances, response times. Mel was 10 feet away, too far to rush before he could fire. Terrence was behind a table full of volatile chemicals. Ramiro stood to Blake's left, hand moving toward his briefcase. You really want to add murder to your list of federal charges? Blake asked calmly. Who said anything about murder? Ramiro's hand emerged from the briefcase holding his own pistol. You came here to buy drugs, became agitated and erratic. Mel, acting as facility security, was forced to defend himself. Very tragic. We'll plant enough product on you to make it believable. The FBI already knows I'm here. Bluffing, Terrence said. If the FBI knew about this facility, we'd have been raided weeks ago. He wasn't wrong. Blake had gambled that Ramiro's arrogance would lead to confession, not execution. Time to adapt. You're right, Blake said. FBI doesn't know yet, but they will when I don't check in. See, I've got insurance, a full written statement from Carlos, documentation of his injuries, all sent to a federal agent. If something happens to me, that gets activated. We'll find the agent, Ramiro said. Handle it. Good luck. She's in D.C., part of a pharmaceutical fraud task force. You really think you can reach her before she buries you? Blake watched the doubt creep into Ramiro's expression. The man was a criminal, but he wasn't a killer, not at his core. This was bluff versus bluff, and Blake had spent years reading enemy combatants across negotiation tables. But Mel LeBlanc was a different story. This is a waste of time, Mel said, his voice flat. We clean it up now, leave town tomorrow, restart somewhere else. Mel, wait, Ramiro started. The gunshot was shockingly loud in the enclosed space. Blake moved on pure instinct, throwing himself sideways as the bullet punched through the air where he'd been standing. He hit the ground rolling, came up behind the chemical storage shelf, his mind racing through tactical options. Unarmed. Kevlar vest, chest and back protected, but head and limbs vulnerable. 3 armed hostiles in a confined space. No backup for at least 20 minutes, even if Rebecca's team mobilized immediately. Another shot splintered the shelf above him, and Blake smelled something acrid. One of the bullets had struck a chemical container. Mel, stop. Terrence shouted. You hit the wrong container, and we all die. The shooting paused. Blake's combat training took over. The chemical smell, sulfuric acid, if he remembered Carlos's descriptions. Highly corrosive, but also potentially useful. He grabbed a glass beaker from the shelf, then a sealed container of what looked like sodium hydroxide. Blake Barnes, Mel's voice called out. Former Marine, 12 years service, 3 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan. Force reconnaissance training. I did my homework too. Blake said nothing, his hands working quickly in the shadows. Mixed sodium hydroxide and aluminum. Carlos had mentioned this reaction during one of their lab overview sessions. It produced hydrogen gas. Lots of it. I respect the service. Mel continued, and Blake could hear him moving, trying to flank. But you picked the wrong fight. These people pay me very well to solve problems. You're a problem. Blake found what he needed. Aluminum metal, stored in a clearly labeled container. He emptied the sodium hydroxide into the beaker, added water from a distillation setup, then dropped in several strips of aluminum. The reaction was immediate and vigorous. Hydrogen gas began pouring from the beaker. What's that smell? Ramiro's voice, nervous. Blake waited 5 seconds, then threw the beaker toward the fluorescent lights overhead. The explosion wasn't massive, but in the enclosed space filled with flammable vapors, it was enough. The lights shattered, plunging the lab into darkness broken only by the emergency exit signs and the glow from Terrence's laptop. Blake moved in the darkness, using skills drilled into him through hundreds of night operations. He heard Mel cursing, Ramiro shouting questions, Terrence trying to calm everyone down. The door. He needed to reach the door. But Mel was there. Blake could see his silhouette against the dim exit sign. The man had positioned himself precisely where Blake needed to go. Plan B. Blake grabbed a metal stand, hefted it, and hurled it toward the opposite corner. The crash brought immediate gunfire, muzzle flashes illuminating the lab in strobes. In that light, Blake saw his opening. He charged, not toward the door, but toward Terrence's workspace where the laptop sat. His hand closed on the computer even as Mel realized the misdirection and swung his weapon around. Blake dropped. The laptop clutched to his chest, and rolled under the work table as bullets punched through the space he'd occupied. He came up on the other side, using the table as cover, and ran for the door. Mel's bullets chased him, striking metal and concrete. Blake felt one graze his shoulder, a hot line of pain that he filed away to deal with later. Then he was through the door, into the night air, sprinting toward his truck. Behind him, he heard shouting. An engine starting. Blake reached his truck, threw the laptop into the passenger seat, and turned the key. The engine roared to life. He floored it, tires screaming as he accelerated out of the parking lot. In his rearview mirror, he saw Ramiro's Mercedes and another vehicle, Mel's black SUV, pull out in pursuit. Blake grabbed his phone with one hand, steering with the other, and dialed Rebecca's emergency number. She answered on the first ring. "Blake, I've got the evidence, but it went bad. 3 armed hostiles in pursuit. My location is," he rattled off the cross streets, heading east on Industrial Boulevard. "I need backup now." "Copy that. I'm mobilizing my team and alerting local police." "Blake, stay on main roads. Keep moving. Don't let them box you in." "I know the drill." Behind him, muzzle flashes lit up the night as Mel fired from his SUV's window. Blake's rear windshield exploded. "They're shooting at you?" Rebecca's voice was sharp. "Yep. ETA on backup is 18 minutes. Can you evade that long?" Blake looked at the vehicles behind him, at the industrial wasteland around him with few exits and fewer witnesses. 18 minutes might as well be 18 hours. "Probably not," he said. "Which means I need to end this now. Blake, do not engage. I repeat, do not." He disconnected, focus narrowing to the tactical problem at hand. 2 vehicles pursuing. Limited ammunition on their side, but superior firepower. His advantages: better knowledge of the area from his pre-mission planning, marine training, and the element of surprise. Time to go on offense. Blake spotted what he needed, a construction site ahead, entrance marked with concrete barriers. He accelerated, then yanked the wheel hard left, sending his truck into a controlled spin that put him perpendicular to the road, blocking it. He threw the truck into reverse, backing between 2 concrete barriers that would protect his flanks. Then he grabbed the laptop, shouldered open his door, and rolled clear just as Mel's SUV came around the corner and opened fire. The truck absorbed the bullets while Blake, using the concrete barriers as cover, circled around. Ramiro's Mercedes skidded to a stop behind the SUV, and Blake heard Ramiro shouting for Mel to stop wasting ammunition. Blake worked his way through the construction site shadows, combat movement drills as familiar as breathing. He reached Ramiro's car from the blind side and yanked open the driver's door. Ramiro yelped, scrambling for his weapon, but Blake was faster. A sharp elbow to the temple, and Ramiro slumped, unconscious. Blake grabbed Ramiro's pistol, a Sig Sauer P365, and checked the magazine. 7 rounds. Better than nothing. "Ramiro," Mel's voice called out. "Ramiro." Blake waited, counting seconds. Then he heard what he'd been hoping for, Mel's footsteps approaching Ramiro's car, the man's tactical discipline breaking down with concern for his employer. When Mel rounded the car, weapon raised, Blake was ready. He fired twice, not to kill, but to disarm. The first shot struck Mel's gun hand, the second hit his shoulder. The big man went down with a cry of pain, his weapon clattering across the pavement. Blake was on him in seconds, kicking the gun away, pressing the Sig's barrel to Mel's head. "Don't move." Mel glared up at him, breathing hard, blood seeping from his wounds. "You won't shoot an unarmed man. I just shot you twice. When I was armed. Now I'm not." Mel's teeth were gritted against pain, but his eyes were calculating. "You're military. You have rules. Honor." Blake thought about Carlos's burned hands, about Ramiro's threats, about how close he'd come to dying in that lab. "You're right," Blake said. "I won't kill an unarmed man." He shifted his aim and shot Mel in the leg. The man screamed. "But I will make sure you can't run before the FBI gets here," Blake continued calmly. "Where's Terrence?" "Still at the lab, probably destroying evidence," Mel gasped out. Blake pulled out his phone and dialed Rebecca again. "I've got Ramiro and Mel LeBlanc detained at my location. Ramiro's unconscious. Mel has gunshot wounds, but is stable. The third suspect, Terrence Reyes, is likely still at the storage facility destroying evidence. Send units to both locations." "Blake, did you just say you shot someone?" "He shot at me first. I defended myself. It's all on the recording." "Jesus Christ." Rebecca sounded like she was aging in real time. Stay put. Don't do anything else. Please. Yes, ma'am. Blake sat on the hood of Ramiro's Mercedes, Sig still trained on Mel, and waited. Adrenaline drained away, leaving exhaustion and the sting of his shoulder wound. The laptop sat next to him, secured. Evidence of chemical burns documented. Recorded confessions captured. In the distance, sirens approached. It was over. Almost. Chapter 7. Aftermath. The next 72 hours were a blur of federal agents, statements, and evidence processing. Rebecca Ross brought in her entire task force, and once they accessed the laptop Blake had stolen, Ramiro's personal computer, it turned out, the case exploded. The financial records were even more damning than Rebecca had hoped. 3 years of detailed transactions, client lists, supplier information, and most critically, evidence of Ramiro's embezzlement from Liberty Med Pharmaceuticals. He'd been stealing not just chemicals, but also proprietary formulas, then manufacturing generic versions for black market sale. Terrence Reyes had indeed tried to destroy evidence. When federal agents raided the storage unit an hour after Blake's call, they found the chemist attempting to pour acid over his laboratory notebooks. Unfortunately for him, he'd chosen the wrong acid and the wrong container. The result was a small explosion that left him with severe burns and unconscious on the floor. Paramedics saved his life, and he woke up in a hospital bed with federal agents waiting to read him his rights. Mel LeBlanc, it turned out, was wanted in 3 states for assault and suspected homicide. Blake's bullets had done law enforcement a favor by keeping him in one place long enough to finally arrest him. His gunshot wounds were treated at the same hospital where Blake had his shoulder graze checked. The 2 men were on different floors, both under guard, though for very different reasons. Blake himself spent the first day giving statements. Rebecca had pulled strings to prevent his arrest for the shooting, arguing self-defense and civilian assistance in apprehending violent felons. The local DA, once Rebecca showed him the evidence of Ramiro's operation and Mel's criminal history, agreed not to press charges. You got lucky, Rebecca told Blake on the second day, meeting him at a coffee shop near his property. Technically, you conducted an unauthorized undercover operation, stole property, and shot 2 people. Technically, I visited my brother-in-law's business, defended myself when attacked, and recovered stolen pharmaceutical company property while preventing the destruction of federal evidence, Blake replied. Rebecca almost smiled. You've been talking to lawyers. Bender recommended one. Of course he did. She slid a folder across the table. The full case breakdown. Ramiro's looking at 25 years minimum, theft, drug manufacturing, child endangerment, assault with a deadly weapon, and about 40 other charges. Terrence is cooperating, trying to reduce his sentence. He's given us names of other operations Ramiro was connected to. And Mel. Life, probably. Even without this case, the Louisiana charges alone would keep him locked up until he's 90. Rebecca's expression hardened. He was the one who threatened Carlos with those photos, by the way. The examples of what happens to people who cause problems. They were real, victims of a gang Mel used to work for. Blake's hands tightened around his coffee cup. The good news, Rebecca continued, is that Carlos's testimony won't be needed for the main trial. Between the physical evidence, financial records, the recording you made, and Terrence's cooperation, the case is airtight. The boy won't have to relive it in court. That is good news. Your sister landed at Atlanta Airport this morning. I sent agents to pick her up, gently, Rebecca added, seeing Blake's expression. She's been informed of the situation. She wants to see Carlos. Blake nodded slowly. How did she take it? About how you'd expect. Shock, guilt that she didn't notice, rage at Ramiro, gratitude toward you. Rebecca paused. She asked if you'd be there when she sees him. Of course. Patty Rubio looked like she'd aged 10 years in the 3 weeks since Blake had last seen her. She stepped out of the federal vehicle looking fragile and exhausted, her eyes red from crying. Blake met her on the porch. She stopped, looking at him, then burst into fresh tears. I'm sorry, she sobbed. I'm so sorry. I should have seen it. I should have protected him. Blake pulled her into a hug. This isn't your fault. How can you say that? My son was being tortured, and I was too blind to notice. Ramiro is a professional manipulator. He fooled a lot of people, including the pharmaceutical company he worked for, his business partners, probably his friends. Blake kept his voice gentle. You're a victim too, Patty. Don't let him take your self-respect along with everything else. Inside, Carlos waited in the living room, looking small and nervous. When Patty saw him, she crossed the distance in 3 strides and wrapped him in her arms. I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry. Mom, it's okay. It's not okay. Nothing about this is okay. Patty pulled back, cupping his face in her hands. But it will be. I promise you it will be. Blake watched them for a moment, then quietly moved to the kitchen to give them privacy. His phone buzzed, a text from Bender. News coverage is intense. You're famous. How's it feel to be a hero? Blake looked through the doorway at his sister comforting her son, at a family beginning to heal from damage it would take years to fully repair. I'm not a hero. Just did what needed to be done, he texted back. That's literally the definition of a hero, you stubborn bastard. Blake smiled and pocketed his phone. Outside, the sun was setting over the Georgia farmland, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Tomorrow would bring more statements, more legal proceedings, more complications. But tonight, his family was safe. And that was enough. Chapter 8, Reckoning. The trial of Ramiro Rubio began 4 months later in federal court. Blake attended every day, sitting in the gallery with Patty and Carlos, a silent reminder to the defense that their client had harmed real people with real consequences. The prosecution, led by Rebecca Ross and a team of federal attorneys, was methodical and devastating. They walked the jury through every aspect of the operation. Day 1, financial evidence. Forensic accountants explained how Ramiro had embezzled over $800,000 in chemicals and proprietary formulas from Liberty Med Pharmaceuticals over 3 years. Day 2, the operation itself. Terrence Reyes, testifying as part of his plea agreement, described the manufacturing process and confirmed that Ramiro had not only known about but encouraged shortcuts that endangered workers, specifically Carlos. Day 3, Carlos's injuries. A pediatric burn specialist testified about the 15 distinct burn incidents documented on the boy's hands and wrists, explaining that the pattern and severity indicated repeated exposure to industrial chemicals without proper safety equipment. Day 4, the threats. FBI analysis of Ramiro's phone and computer revealed messages to Mel LeBlanc discussing handling the kid's loose lips and ensuring the family understands consequences. Day 5, the night of Blake's confrontation. The recording Blake had made was played in its entirety, Ramiro's voice admitting to everything from child endangerment to attempted murder. The defense tried to paint Ramiro as a Robin Hood figure, stealing from pharmaceutical giants to help the poor. It might have worked if not for the evidence of personal enrichment. The luxury cars, expensive watches, a vacation home in the Bahamas, all purchased with proceeds from the operation. They tried to suggest Blake had entrapped Ramiro, that he'd been the aggressor. That fell apart when Rebecca introduced evidence of Mel's attempted murder, supported by the ballistic analysis showing all fired rounds came from weapons registered to Mel and Ramiro, not Blake. They tried to minimize Carlos's injuries as workplace accidents. The prosecution responded by calling Carlos to the stand. Blake would never forget watching his nephew walk to the witness box, no longer wearing gloves, his scarred hands visible to the entire courtroom. The boy had grown in the months since summer, not just physically, but in confidence. Therapy had helped, as had the knowledge that his tormentors would face justice. Mr. Rubio, Carlos said when asked to identify his stepfather, told me that if I ever spoke about the lab, people I loved would disappear. He showed me pictures of bodies. He said that's what happened to problems. And were you a problem? The prosecutor asked gently. I was a child, Carlos replied, voice steady, who needed protection. Instead, I got burned, threatened, and used until I was no longer profitable. The defense attorney tried to break him on cross-examination, suggesting his uncle had coached him, that he was exaggerating for sympathy. Carlos looked the attorney dead in the eye and removed his jacket, showing the burn scars that extended up both arms. I don't need coaching to remember pain, Carlos said quietly. And I don't need sympathy. I need justice. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Ramiro Rubio, 47 years old, stood before the judge who would determine his fate. He'd lost weight in jail, his expensive suits replaced by an orange jumpsuit, his confident smile nowhere in evidence. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Rebecca Ross, not the FBI agent, but a federal judge who'd built her career prosecuting organized crime reviewed the case with granite eyes. "Mr. Rubio," she began, "I have presided over hundreds of cases in my 30 years on this bench. Murder, fraud, conspiracy, racketeering. But rarely have I seen something as fundamentally reprehensible as what you did to your stepson." She detailed the crimes, the evidence, the impact. Then she asked if Ramiro had anything to say. He stood, and for a moment, Blake thought he might apologize. Instead, "I was trying to help people," Ramiro said. "The pharmaceutical industry is corrupt, and You were enriching yourself," the judge interrupted, "at the expense of your family, your employer, and most disgracefully, a child. Your actions warrant the maximum sentence under federal guidelines." She sentenced him to 35 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. With good behavior, Ramiro Rubio would be 77 when he got out, if he lived that long. Mel LeBlanc, tried separately for attempted murder and a raft of charges from Louisiana, received life without parole. Terrence Reyes, in exchange for his cooperation, got 12 years. The judge made it clear he was getting a deal only because his testimony had helped dismantle not just Ramiro's operation, but 3 other illegal pharmaceutical labs the task force had identified. Outside the courthouse, news cameras swarmed. Blake tried to avoid them, but one reporter managed to corner him. "Mr. Barnes, you've been called a hero for bringing down this operation. How do you respond?" Blake looked at the camera, thinking about his answer. "I'm not a hero. I'm an uncle who protected his nephew. Anyone in my position would have done the same. But not everyone has your training, your skill set." "Then maybe that's the problem," Blake interrupted. "Maybe we shouldn't need former Marines to protect children from the adults who are supposed to care for them. Maybe we should build a society where what happened to my nephew is impossible. Where pharmaceutical companies don't charge thousands of dollars for medications that cost pennies to produce. Where people aren't driven to black markets out of desperation. Where children are protected as a default, not an exception." The reporter blinked, clearly not expecting a political statement. "But until we build that society," Blake continued, "yeah, I'll be the uncle who burns down the world to keep his family safe. And I won't apologize for it." He walked away, leaving the reporter speechless, and found Patty and Carlos waiting by his truck. "That was a good speech," Patty said. "I meant every word." Carlos, standing between them, looked up at Blake. "What happens now?" "Now." Blake unlocked the truck. "Now we go home. I've got a Mustang that needs finishing, you've got homework to catch up on, and your mom needs help deciding what to do with the house." Patty had filed for divorce immediately after Ramiro's arrest. The house they'd shared was technically marital property, but given that it had been purchased with proceeds from criminal activity, it was being seized by the government. She'd moved in with Blake temporarily, planning to find her own place once the legal mess was sorted. "I was thinking," Carlos said as they drove away from the courthouse, "maybe I don't go back to Atlanta. Maybe I stay in Georgia. With you." Blake glanced at Patty in the rearview mirror. She gave him a small nod. "Your mom and I talked about this," Blake said. "If that's what you want, we'll make it work. But you should know, I'm not going to go easy on you. You'll have chores, responsibilities, expectations. I know. And you'll be in therapy for as long as the doctors say you need it. I know. And if you ever find yourself in trouble again, you tell me immediately. No secrets, no trying to handle it alone. Deal?" Carlos extended his scarred hand. "Deal." Blake shook it, noting how much stronger the boy's grip had gotten over the months. "Then welcome to your new life, kiddo. It's going to be boring, quiet, and filled with hard work." "Sounds perfect," Carlos said, and for the first time in months, he smiled. Chapter 9, Moving Forward. 6 months later, Blake stood in his workshop, hands covered in engine grease, listening to Carlos explain the intricacies of fuel injection systems. The boy had taken to automotive restoration with the same intensity he'd once brought to chemistry, but this time, nobody was forcing him, and the only burns he got were minor ones from touching hot metal. "See, the problem with the original carburetor design," Carlos was saying, pointing to the dismantled Mustang engine, "is that it doesn't account for modern ethanol blends. We need to either rebuild it with ethanol-resistant seals or convert to fuel injection. Expensive either way," Blake noted. "Yeah, but worth it if we want her to run properly." The Mustang had become a joint project, something they worked on together in the evenings after Carlos finished his schoolwork. The boy was attending the local high school now, a freshman who jumped ahead in science and math, but struggled with the social aspects. Therapy was helping with that too. Patty appeared in the workshop doorway, carrying a pitcher of sweet tea. She'd found work as an office manager for a local construction company and had just closed on a small house 3 miles from Blake's property. Close enough for family dinners, far enough for independence. "Boys," she called out, "take a break. Blake, you've got a visitor." Blake wiped his hands on a rag and walked to the front of the house, where he found Nathan Bender leaning against a rental car. "Bender, didn't know you were coming down. Surprise visit." Bender grinned. "Thought I'd check on George's most famous vigilante uncle." "I wasn't a vigilante. I was protecting your family, I know. You've given that speech about 50 times. Bender's expression sobered. "Actually, I'm here on business. My security company is expanding, opening a regional office in Atlanta. We need someone to run operations. I'm not interested in private security work. Not even if it paid twice what you make in construction and let you help train a team focused on investigating domestic crimes, child endangerment, abuse cases, situations where traditional law enforcement can't or won't act." Blake paused. "You're serious. Dead serious. Rebecca Ross is consulting on the legal side, making sure we operate within the law. We've already got contracts with 3 nonprofits that work with at-risk children. The idea is to be proactive, identify threats before they escalate to what happened with Carlos." "That's ambitious." "It's necessary." Bender handed Blake a business card. "Think about it. No pressure, but the offer stands. You've got skills that could help a lot of people." After Bender left, Blake stood on his porch, watching the sunset and thinking about the offer. He'd spent years serving his country, then years building a quiet life. Now Bender was offering something in between, a way to use his training for something meaningful without the bureaucracy of military service. "You should do it," Carlos said, joining him on the porch. "Eavesdropping. You were talking 10 feet from an open window. That's not eavesdropping. That's being aware of my surroundings." Carlos grinned, then turned serious. "You're good at helping people, Uncle Blake. You saved me. Maybe you could save others too." "It's not that simple." "Why not?" Blake thought about how to explain the weight of responsibility, the moral complexity of operating in gray areas between law and justice. Then he realized he was talking to a kid who'd been forced to make impossible choices for months. "You're right," Blake said. "It is that simple. I have skills. People need help. The math works. So you'll take the job?" "I'll think about it." Blake ruffled Carlos's hair, earning a protest. "Now go inside and finish your homework. Just because you're ahead in science doesn't mean you get to slack off in English." "Yes, sir," Carlos said, mock saluting, before heading back inside. Blake stood alone on the porch, phone in hand, looking at Bender's business card. In the workshop, the Mustang waited, half restored. In the house, Patty was cooking dinner. He could smell chicken and garlic. Somewhere in the distance, cicadas sang their evening chorus. This was peace. This was what he'd fought for, bled for, killed for. A quiet life with family, away from violence and chaos. But peace wasn't the same as purpose. He thought about Carlos's scarred hands, healing but never fully healed. About Ramiro's other victims, identified through the task force investigation, a dozen people, mostly young, who'd been exploited in various ways. About the news stories he saw every week of children hurt by adults who should have protected them. Blake pulled out his phone and dialed Bender's number. "That was fast," Bender answered. "I've got conditions. I work remotely when possible. I'm not moving to Atlanta. Cases involving kids get priority. And I want final say on which operations I participate in." "Done, done, and done. When can you start?" "Give me 2 weeks to finish the Mustang. Carlos and I made a promise to each other that we'd see it through. 2 weeks it is. Welcome to the team, Barnes." Blake ended the call and looked out at his property, the house his parents had built, the land he'd sworn to protect, the life he'd carved out of discipline and determination. He wasn't leaving it behind. He was expanding it, taking the lessons learned in combat and the lessons learned protecting Carlos, and applying them to a larger mission. The screen door creaked, and Patty stepped out. So I'm starting a new job in 2 weeks." She smiled. "Good. You were getting restless anyway." "Was I?" "Blake, you reorganized your tool shed 3 times last month and built a new fence that didn't need building. You're not designed for idle." She squeezed his shoulder. Dad would be proud, of how you handled everything. Their father had been a quiet man, a builder like Blake, someone who believed in solving problems through direct action and personal responsibility. He died when Blake was 16, a construction accident, quick and brutal. Blake had joined the Marines partly to honor that legacy of service. I hope so, Blake said. I know so. Now come inside before dinner gets cold. And tell Carlos to put away his phone. We have a family rule about devices at the table. Blake followed her inside, into warmth and light, and the comfortable chaos of a family healing. Outside, night fell over Georgia, bringing stars and cricket song and the promise of tomorrow. The Mustang would get finished. Carlos would continue therapy and grow into the young man he was meant to be, unburdened by the scars of his past. Patty would rebuild her life, stronger and wiser. And Blake would do what he did best, protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Ramiro Rubio would spend decades in a cell, his empire dismantled, his reputation destroyed. Mel LeBlanc would die in prison, forgotten by everyone except his victims. Terrence Reyes would serve his time and hopefully emerge with a conscience. Justice, Blake reflected, wasn't always perfect. But sometimes, when you fought hard enough and refused to accept defeat, it was enough. At the dinner table, Carlos was explaining his latest school project, something about renewable energy and solar panel efficiency. Patty listened with the fierce attention of a mother making up for lost time. Blake passed the mashed potatoes and thought about the strange path that had led him here. A nephew's desperate secret. A summer that changed everything. A confrontation that could have ended in tragedy, but instead ended in justice. And now, a future built on the foundation of survival, resilience, and the unshakable certainty that family, real family, protects each other, no matter the cost. Uncle Blake, Carlos said, pulling him from his thoughts. You're not listening. Sorry, kiddo. What were you saying? I was saying that I want to study criminal justice in college. Maybe become a prosecutor, help put away people like Ramiro. Patty's eyes widened. Are you sure? After everything. Especially after everything. Carlos interrupted. Someone helped me when I couldn't help myself. I want to be that person for others. Blake met his nephew's eyes, clear, determined, healed in the ways that mattered most. Then that's what you'll do, Blake said. And I'll help you every step of the way. They finished dinner talking about the future, colleges, careers, the Mustang's first drive once it was completed. Outside, the Georgia night wrapped around the farmhouse like a protective blanket, and inside, a family that had been broken found itself stronger than it had ever been whole. Later, after Patty and Carlos had gone to bed, Blake sat on the porch with a beer, looking at the stars. His phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca Ross. Saw the news about Bender's new hire. Congratulations. If you ever need FBI coordination, you have my number. Blake smiled and typed back, appreciate it. Hopefully, we won't need to team up again. Hopefully. But if we do, I know you'll get the job done. You always do. He pocketed the phone and finished his beer, listening to the night sounds of rural Georgia. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, new people who needed help. But tonight, his family was safe, his nephew was healing, and justice, imperfect but real, had been served. It was enough. It was everything. Epilogue. 3 years later, Blake Barnes stood in a courtroom in Virginia, waiting for a verdict in a case his team had spent 8 months building. Child trafficking ring, 17 victims recovered, 9 perpetrators arrested. Carlos, now 17 and preparing for college, sat in the gallery with Patty. The boy had grown tall, confident, his hands still scarred but no longer hidden. He'd testified as a consultant on this case, using his experience to help identify manipulation tactics used on the victims. The jury foreman stood. We find the defendants guilty on all counts. Blake allowed himself a small smile. Another win. Another group of children saved. Another set of predators removed from society. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. They always did now. Blake's team had developed a reputation for taking cases other agencies couldn't or wouldn't touch, for operating in the gray areas of the law while staying just inside legal boundaries. Mr. Barnes, one reporter called out, this is your 32nd successful prosecution in 3 years. What drives you to keep doing this work? Blake looked back at Carlos, who nodded encouragement. 3 years ago, Blake said to the cameras, someone I loved was hurt by people who were supposed to protect him. And I learned that the system, as good as it is, has gaps. Places where predators can hide, where victims fall through cracks. My team exists to fill those gaps. Do you consider yourself a vigilante? No. I consider myself a concerned citizen with specialized skills and a refusal to look away when children are in danger. Blake's voice was firm. Vigilantes operate outside the law. We work within it, sometimes right at the edge, but always within it. Because the goal isn't revenge. It's justice. And what's the difference? Blake thought about Ramiro in his cell, about Mel dying slowly in prison, about every predator his team had helped put away. Revenge is about making yourself feel better, he said. Justice is about making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. He walked away from the cameras, toward his family, toward his team waiting in a van, toward the next case that would need his skills and attention. The summer that changed everything had been 3 years ago, but its lessons remained. Family protects family. Justice is worth fighting for. And sometimes the right person in the right place at the right time can change everything. Blake Barnes had been that person once. And he planned to keep being that person for as long as children needed protecting and predators needed stopping. The work was hard. The cost was high. The victories were never perfect. But they were worth it. Every single time. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.